My sermon is on four sections, 4 parts. So I'll start off with a story. When I was younger, my family and I would go to church each Sunday, and I was quite disobedient at church. I would run over people, I'd run under people, I'd run everywhere, and they'd give me this massive space at the back of the room and say, stay in that spot, but I never would. I was extremely disobedient. Even at home, I wouldn't stay in bed when my parents sent me to bed. I wouldn't eat when I should. I wouldn't do anything my parents told me. It was really bad. At church, I'd often get called taken into the cry room by my dad, so that I wouldn't distract everyone else at church. Because it wasn't just my parents I was distracting; it was me. It was everyone else I was distracting. And then I'd get home and I'd get in trouble. I'd have to sit down in a corner with an egg timer, or I might even get smacked. But luckily, as I grew up, I learnt obedience. Although it wasn't easy for me, I did get smacked as a kid. My dad would just hit me on the bum and send me to bed. But so I learnt through physical. I learnt physically punishment, and so it wasn't easy for me to learn obedience, but luckily I did. And so through this I slowly learnt obedience. A great example of disobedience that I love is the story of Jonah. So I'm just going to read Jonah chapter 1 once I get there. Jonah 1, verse 1 to 17. So it says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai." Oh, this is from NIV, by the way. "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and they cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running from the Lord, because he had told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So we hear Jonah's disobedience of the Lord. For one, it didn't just affect him, it affected everyone on the ship. Same as when I was disobedient, it didn't just affect me, it affected everyone in the church service. And the other thing is that Jonah learned obedience through physical punishment. as I did through physical punishment, although his was a lot more violent than mine. Some scholars have suggested that him being in that fish for 3 days and 3 nights, on the best of times, he would have come out with skin burn from the belly and bleached hair and skin and everything, and even like on the mental side, his mental condition, his body clock wouldn't be right because he wouldn't know what time of day it was, and he would have been in complete isolation for 3 days and 3 nights. So this is a bit more fierce punishment than my parents ever did to me, but it taught Jonah the importance of obedience, and he learnt a lot quicker than I did. So obedience is important, and I'll come back to it soon, but first I'm going to talk about planning. We all have plans. We have short-term plans, like what we're going to have for lunch or dinner. And we have long-term plans, like whether or not to move somewhere or start a new job or a new long-term project. Well, again, let me tell you about my plans. This time 2 years ago, I was halfway through finishing year 12, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. It was aiming towards the Air Force in an IT role, but I really didn't like that idea. But it was the only one I had, so that was my long-term plan. And after a few months, the school came to me and offered me an IT traineeship at the school. So that was a much better idea in my books. So I took that traineeship, and that was my new plan. This time last year, I was working at the school. I had been at that school for my entire prep to 12, and I was doing my dream job, an IT administrator in a Christian environment around youth and students, and with the best colleagues I could get. So my long-term plan had changed. I had planned on staying at that school, possibly eventually taking the position of IT manager, and allowing the current IT manager to move to the city where his family lives. Things were looking up for me, and those around me and my parents, they were really happy with what I was doing, and my parents had also planned on moving to Bundaberg, which I can say that they're now happily living in Bundaberg. They moved there about a month ago, which is really really good. But my plans were set on staying in Kadina. I'd organised a rental with a friend for when my parents left, and that was my plans. But plans don't always go the way that we think that they're going to go. Whether they go good or bad, they don't go the way we think they'll go. I just want to read another story about planning. And this is from Genesis chapter 11. This is the Tower of Babel. So I'll just read Genesis 11, verses 1 to 9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the whole face of the earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because the Lord confused their language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them all over the face of the whole earth. It's a bit of a weird story. I read it in preparation of this, and I've never read it straight from the Bible before, and I was a bit confused at why God saw that they were doing something that they had put their heads to, and he's like, "I don't like that," and so he confused their language. But the thing that we need to take from that is that God wasn't in their plans. And without God in their plans, it may succeed, but it won't be for the best of them. And this was what my plans were in my life. I didn't have God in my plans. And so, where am I? Yeah. So God will always step in if he's not in your plans. He'll always step in. He'll open doors and close doors. He'll put us on a new path that will make that'll work better for everyone than our own plans. And when we make plans, we need to make sure that they glorify God, not separate them from God. In Mark 16, verse 15, Jesus tells us that our job is to go out and preach the good news to all creation. This is our mission given by Jesus. So all of our plans need to lean towards completing that mission. If they are, well, God will be in them. He will help you achieve and accomplish them. But if they are not, well, God will show you that as well. As I said before, he closes doors. He makes it clear to you what plans are best for you and best for those around you. And so in my story, God stepped in and brought Capernwray into my life. And the crazy thing is that, yeah, Capernwray was cool, but the way that I got to Capernwray was that I had to give up my job at home. I had to sacrifice that. The school told me that they probably can't hold onto the position for me. And so I sacrificed that to come here. And 2 months after I registered for Capernwray, the board decided that they could hold on to my position for me. So I sacrificed that job for God, and then God came and gave that job back to me. And so that now, that my mission, my plan is the same, but now God is in that plan, whereas he wasn't before. So I guess the question is, how do we know if our plans are in pursuit of this mission? Well, the first answer is prayer. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 simply states, pray continually. Just ask God what he thinks about your plans. He will tell you. And then we need patience, to wait for his response, to be watchful for the ways he speaks to us, to look out for the doors that he opens and the doors that he closes. The next way is what Paul spoke on in Romans 12. Verse 2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Well, this is something new now. We've gone from our plans to God's will. So what is God's will? Well, God's will is his plan for your life, his plan for my life, his plan for the entire universe. God's will in Romans 12 verse 2 is described as perfect, pleasing, and good. So now on to good. What is good? We all know in Jeremiah 29 verse 11 that it says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. So God's will is pleasing to me. It won't harm me. It won't prosper me. It will give me a hope and a future. Is this what good is? Well, our earthly definition of good is not quite the same as God's heavenly definition of good. You see, we link good and bad to happiness and sadness. We say sometimes if something good happens to us, then that would make us happy. And if something bad happens to us, that would make us unhappy. Well, what about that person in the world who's making heaps of money on human trafficking? He's happy. Is he good? And what about in the Bible when Joseph was sold as a slave? Was that good? I just want to read from that story, but I'll give a brief recap before. So Joseph was the youngest in his family. He had 11 brothers, and it also says that at this time he was around 17 years old. So Joseph was the favorite in his family by his parents and family friends, and his brothers really hated him because of that. They were jealous of him. Joseph had a few dreams about his family bowing down to him, and that made his brothers hate him more. So much that they plotted to kill him. So I'm just going to read Genesis 37, verses 19 to 28. So his brothers say, "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness. But don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Galilee. Their camels were loaded with spices, balms, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came up, his brother pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And verse 36 says the Midianites sold him to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials. So was this good? Well, probably at the time, Joseph wouldn't have felt that way about it. He probably would have been upset at his brothers and probably upset at God for putting him through this. But in chapter 39, just 2 chapters later, in verse 2 to 4, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owed." So even through all of this, the Lord was still with him, and he prospered. Goodness, I believe, is anything that happens to glorify God. In Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph is talking to his brothers, and it says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." So this is good. Whatever is being done to glorify God's name and help those around us with it. So this is God's will for us, to glorify him, to show others who he is. And if we follow his will for us, we may come under hardships. John 16, verse 33 says, Jesus is saying, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." We will all have trouble, that's for sure. And I don't know why I'm preaching this. I'm sure you guys know that more than I do. But we need to know that through everything, if our plans line up with God's will, the trouble will be for good, and it will all work out to glorify him. God doesn't do what's best for us. He knows and sees the bigger picture. He does what is best for everyone. So we've talked about plans, we've talked about God's will, and at the start I talked about the importance of obedience. But something that is equally important is trust. And that's because obedience only comes from trust. If you don't trust someone, you have no reason to obey them. So can we trust God? Well, in short, yes we can. But why can we? God has demonstrated through the entire Bible why we can and should trust him. I'll just run through a few stories that we can find in the Bible. Genesis 2, verse 17. God says, "Do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good or evil, or you will die." Well, Adam and Eve ate from the tree, and they didn't just physically die, but they died spiritually as their relationship with God was cut off. Genesis 18, verse 10. One of the 3 visitors told Abraham that in 1 year his wife would have a son. This was pretty big because Sarah was well past the age to have children, and she was barren. But we can see in chapter 21 that in fact a year later the Lord did keep his promise and she did have a son. Genesis 22, this was the testing of Abraham's trust in the Lord. He asked him to take his only son and sacrifice him for the Lord. Abraham did this, but before he killed him, or before he was able to kill him, the Lord told him to stop and not kill him, instead provided a ram for the sacrifice. Exodus is a big book that is full of reasons why God is trustworthy. When God came to Moses in the burning bush and told him to go to Egypt to save his people, Moses had to have full trust in the Lord that he would do this. And the funny thing is that we see is that Moses didn't trust him immediately. I'm just going to read Exodus 4, verse 1 to 7. It says, Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. The Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that you may believe that the Lord your God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand in his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. "Now put your hand back in your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back in his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. So we see that God demonstrated his trustworthiness to Moses by showing him different miracles. But others trusted God immediately without needing signs, like David. 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath. David had full trust in God when he went up against Goliath, and God proved his trustworthiness here once again by killing Goliath. And then this same trust that David had in God made him one of the best kings there ever has been. Daniel also had complete trust in God in Daniel 6, when God protected him when he was put in the den of lions for praying. That's a few things in the Old Testament on how we can trust God, why we can trust God, and why we should trust God. And I'm sure there's plenty in the New Testament that I can show you as well. So yes, we can trust God. He has never let anyone down. He has never broken a promise, and he promises that he never will. So we make plans. Everyone can agree on that. And sometimes those plans don't work. We can all agree on that too. And a way to increase the chances of those plans working is to ask God to see if it lines up with his plans for us. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But as I said at the very beginning, the most important thing is obedience, which we can only do when we fully trust and believe in God. Whether our plans do line up with his or not, we need to trust and obey and do what he tells us to do. Whether we think it is good for us or not, he knows what is best for everyone. We just need to trust and obey. Thank you.